During the Second World War, there were no fiercer rivals in the entire conflict than Adolf Hitler, leader of Germany, and Joseph Stalin, hierarch of the Soviet Union. The brutal battles between the two countries exceeded the tens of millions of dead, with blood spilled over thousands of kilometers. However, the relationship between these powers did not always have the same nature. At the beginning of the war, and despite their diametrically opposite sides, they were faithful allies, coming to fight and invade other countries together. However, both knew that it was only a matter of time before this bond broke. There was no doubt that the blood would flow. The only question was who would accept the first blow and who would be victorious. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you everything about the intriguing pact between two of the most sinister figures in history, Stalin and Hitler. From the creation of this alliance to its explosive destruction. A few months before the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939, Hitler was preparing to continue his campaign of conquest. Austria and the region of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia were already in his hands, invaded and annexed without any resistance. The other powers in Europe, mainly the United Kingdom and France, had weakly resisted these operations, but their complaints were ignored by the Führer. The next objective of the Third Reich was in the east. It was Poland, a prize longed for by the Nazi hierarch, who sought to expand his empire to this territory. But unlike his previous victims, the Poles made it clear that if they dared to cross the border, they would be received with a storm of bullets. On this occasion, the British and French also threatened that if the country's sovereignty was put at risk, the war would be declared. In any case, Hitler was not very concerned about this scenario. He did not believe in the threats from the Allied side and thought that even if they were true, his armies would not be able to resist the modern German forces. But there was an aspect of the situation that took his sleep away. If the war began, what would his main enemy, the Soviet Union, do? Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Euro-Asian giant, asked himself the same question about his rival. He had no doubt about what the Nazism of him and his people, made up largely of Slavs and Jews. The ideology of the party considered them inferior and subhuman, unworthy of sharing the planet with the superior Aryan race. In turn, communism threatened traditional Western values and was a direct path to barbarism. The survival of the German man would only be guaranteed when they were destroyed. The war between the two nations was inevitable. The territory desired by Hitler could only be obtained through war. Knowing this, Stalin tried to negotiate treaties with the United Kingdom and France to achieve a defensive alliance, ensuring that if one was invaded, the others would come to his aid. But these agreements never came. The Soviets suspected that the Allies wanted the Russians and Germans to get stuck in a long and costly war, leaving the rest of Europe free of hostilities. For his part, Hitler did not want an alliance of this type to be cemented, as he feared facing a two-sided war. That is why he resorted to a plan as desperate as surprising. He would establish a pact with his greatest enemy before any other treaty could take place. This is how the rapprochements between the ministers of foreign affairs of Germany, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and the Soviet Union, Vyacheslav Molotov, took place. To the surprise of many, who perhaps expected that the negotiations between these rivals would not prosper, these were carried out very quickly. On August 23, 1939, with the approval of their respective heads of state, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. In it, 10 years of war between the two countries. In this way, Hitler could invade Poland and even get stuck in a war with the Allies without risk of Soviet intervention. For his part, Stalin would have time to organize his Red Army for the conflict against the Germans, which, despite the treaty, he still believed impossible to avoid. But in the pact, there was a secret clause. According to this, Eastern Europe would be divided into two regions, one under the German power and the other controlled by the Communists. Stalin demanded Finland, the Baltic countries, and much of Romania. The rest could fall into the hands of Nazism. Poland, for its part, would be torn apart and divided between the two, each with a half. After the security that gave him the success of the negotiations, Hitler set in motion his plans again. On September 1st, 1939, just 8 days after the signing of the treaty, the German soldiers crossed the border with Poland, thus beginning the Second World War. The defenders could do little against the tanks and a much larger German army, better trained and equipped. Despite the fact that the British and French fulfilled their promise and declared war on the Reich, they did not send men, and the Poles were forced to retreat more and more in their own territory. The battle seemed lost. The defenders believed that the situation could not get any worse, but they were wrong. On September 17th, everything came out of control. From the other end of the country, the Red Army also invaded Poland. The locals, confused by the new enemy, in many cases did not even open fire while the Soviets advanced towards the heart of the nation. On October 6th, just over a month after the attack began, the Polish forces were completely defeated by this lethal alliance. Both conquerors began their terror processes against the civilian population. Members of the German SS massacred tens of thousands of Poles, most of them of Jewish origin. In just a few weeks, they were not the only ones. Stalin ordered to do the same. This happened, for example, in the massacre of Katyn, a series of mass killings that ended the lives of more than 20,000 people, all of them belonging to the intellectual, political and military spheres of Poland were crumpled to cold blood. Only in 1943 would the macabre common graves be discovered where their bodies were buried. For the nations of the West, this scenario was completely hopeless. Stalin and Hitler seemed to be acerbic partners, willing to deploy their territorial ambitions to the rest of Europe. And although the Soviet leader had not declared war on the United Kingdom or France, he could not be counted on for a mutual destruction against the Führer, as had been the original plan of the Allies. According to some members of the German Dome, the Nazi hierarch was confident in Soviet loyalty. But the truth is that Stalin did not waste time fortifying his positions, preparing for a German invasion that he continued to consider inevitable. He began to mobilize his forces towards the countries that had fallen under his sphere of influence. According to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, the Baltic nations, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were forced to choose between a peaceful or violent annexation. The three decided not to take up arms. Finland, on the other hand, offered fierce resistance, starting on November 30th, 1939, to what was known as the Winter War. At the end of 3 months, the Finns had to surrender, and although they gave territory to the Soviet Union, the country was not conquered in its entirety. Stalin had not achieved his goal, and during the brutal contest, the Red Army lost around 125,000 soldiers. This was not the first time that the world witnessed the incompetence of the communist forces, whose most experienced generals had been shot down under the orders of Stalin himself in previous years, during the Great Purge that began in 1936. Although in theory they were his allies, Hitler rejoiced at the bloodshed of the Russians. The Führer ended up convincing himself that when the time came for his elimination, they would not pose a real danger to the Third Reich, but for the moment his objectives were others. On May 10, 1940, the German army launched a massive invasion of its western neighbors. France, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg were attacked simultaneously. Despite all the defensive preparations they had taken, in just 6 weeks they were defeated and their countries conquered. The British forces that had been sent to assist their allies ended up being expelled from the continent, not without first suffering terrible casualties. With the French surrender, the United Kingdom became the only force still standing against the domination of the Third Reich. For the Nazis, this was a huge triumph. For Stalin, it was terrible news. He was extremely nervous. He was racing around, cursing like a cab driver. He cursed the French. He cursed the English. How could they allow Hitler to defeat them? To crush them? Stalin not only saw the superiority of the German army, he knew that the Germans sensed our weakness because of the war we had fought with Finland. Stalin wanted the Western nations to destroy each other in a devastating war. But the quick German victory shook his hopes. without any strong enemy in the West. He knew that it was a matter of time before Hitler's ambitious eyes landed in the East. But his armies were not ready to deal with the powerful Nazi war machine. They needed more time. In those moments of doubt, he received a letter from then British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. In the message, he urged an alliance between his countries, appealing to what both knew: the Soviet Union would be the new objective of Nazism. Stalin, however, decided to show his loyalty to the Führer and informed him of the intentions of the English. But this turned out to be a terrible mistake. After the crushing defeat of France, Hitler was surprised that the United Kingdom had not tried to negotiate peace with Germany. This was added to by Franklin Roosevelt, when he was re-elected President of the United States, denounced the German ideology in his acceptance speech. The Nazi leader felt that these two countries would be the nucleus of a new alliance, created in order to defeat his forces. The revelation that the Soviet Union had been invited to join did nothing but cement his suspicions. If Stalin accepted, his position would no longer be so weak and he could face the powerful German army. Thus, Hitler came to a brutal conclusion. The communists must be crushed immediately. In any case, other campaigns in the theater of Western operations, such as the air battle of England, kept him more busy than he would have liked. By the beginning of 1941, however, his plans were already underway. Although the United Kingdom was still at war, the Führer thought it was not a risk, and despite Roosevelt's fiery speeches, the United States was still neutral. It was time for the most ambitious operation of Nazi Germany, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Stalin received numerous reports from his spies warning him of the troops' movements on the German border. Even Churchill himself shared similar reports from his own agents, but the communist leader decided to ignore them. He did not think that the forces of the Reich would get involved in a two-front war, so he argued that while the United Kingdom remained firm in the conflict, his territory would be safe. But his way of thinking was not the same as that of his rival. He himself was a methodical, calculating, hard-working man, a master of detail, personally signing death lists at one extreme and at the other, keeping the tiniest details of gold production in his notebook. Hitler, by contrast, was at heart an idle dreamer. On June 22, 1941, Hitler ordered the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. From the Finnish border in the north to the Romanian border in the south, the Axis forces invaded the Soviet Union on a scale never seen before. Stalin, who thought he had more time to prepare his men, was surprised by the brutality of his former ally. In just a few days, the tanks advanced hundreds of kilometers inland, destroying everything in their path. Entire villages were set on fire along with all their inhabitants, while German planes launched tons of explosives over the cities. In weeks, Soviet deaths reached terrifying numbers. Stalin, a victim of fear and fury, ordered the execution of some of the generals in charge of the initial defense. Clearly, this did not improve his terrible situation. German officers, being witnesses to the disorganization and chaos that reigned in the Russian ranks, considered that the campaign would be short-lived. Some reported to Hitler that they would be at the gates of Moscow in a maximum of 4 months. Others spoke of only 2 weeks. The Führer was happy with the way things were going. He no longer had to pretend to be an ally of a people and an ideology that he saw as inferior. He also considered that once the Soviet Union was crushed, the United Kingdom would hasten to a firm peace as German supremacy would be demonstrated. And if they didn't, the resources that would be taken from the communists, such as the sources of steel and oil, would also allow Churchill to be defeated. But there was an unforeseen event in the German plans. With his armies trapped in a war against the Soviets, the British could go to the offensive, and so they did in North Africa, where the fights between the Allies and their enemies were still going on. The German situation worsened even more when, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. This was the Mecca that the Americans used to ignite their fighting spirit and finally join the war against the Axis forces. Meanwhile, the Red Army, despite its initial disasters, was proving to be a more feared enemy than thought. Stalin and his generals quickly mobilized the reserves of men, and despite the terrible casualty, there were still fighters ready to face the invaders. They also managed to move their heavy industries from western cities beyond the Ural Mountains. In this way, the resources that the Germans so longed for were kept out of their reach, and the locals were able to continue building the necessary war material to fight. After 4 months, the deadline that several German officers had set as the maximum point of Russian resistance had not been able to meet almost any of their objectives. Moscow continued firmly in Soviet hands, and now a patriotic fervor circulated among the men and women of the Union. Everyone would do their part to eliminate the Nazi aggressors. With the entry of the United States into the conflict, the main axis of the anti-Nazi resistance made up of North Americans, British and Soviets. In this way, Hitler ended up being the cause of creating the alliance that he feared so much and that led him to betray his former partner. Beginning in 1942, with the joint operations of the Western powers and the Communists, the German situation only worsened. As German morale and resources decreased rapidly, the spirit of Soviet struggle continued to grow. When the invaders tried to conquer Stalingrad in the middle of that year, their forces were devastated by the resistance of the defenders. Hitler, suffering the shortage of soldiers and equipment, was forced to order the withdrawal. In the following years, all the territory they had conquered was liberated until the fighting reached German soil itself. The Führer, cornered and desperate, succumbed to his paranoia, which ended up taking him to the grave in April 1945. We have reached the end of this video and we want to ask you, do you think the war could have ended differently if Hitler did not betray Stalin? Leave us your answer in the comment box below and do not forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.